Thank you, Jason, for being able to set us up with that. Can you hear me good? Okay, so I have the opportunity to be able to be here today with you to be able to describe ways of knowing. And I think a lot of you provide opportunities to increase that ways of knowing by being able to do the programming that you do, to be able to provide tools for end users like myself to have a better understanding about our environment at various scales, both not only at different spatial scales, but also different temporal scales. So I wanted to give you a little bit of background. So I'm from the Navajo Nation. We have a philosophy that is taught very young in life. Simply put in English is only three words. So a lot is lost in translation. But in learning this philosophy throughout my lifetime, it's inclusive of so much more than that. So much within our environment, including the saplings that are in the mountains, as well as the food that we grow, as well as the domesticated livestock that we have, as well as the wildlife, the medicinal plants that we have relied upon for millennia. And this is taught from a very young age. But in that type of thinking is also an interaction with the land. I know maybe in fourth grade or in elementary school sometime you learned about the water cycle. And when you look at the water, well, at least when I looked at the water cycle in elementary school, I'm like, where's the ocean here in northeastern Arizona? And so it was hard for me to be able to develop that type of relationship to the water cycle. But the water cycle, where in the Four Corners region of the United States, really looks more like this. You may have driven across the Navajo Nation. It's the largest land-based tribe in the United States, similar in size to the state of West Virginia or the country of Ireland. We do have perennial streams. Maybe if you've driven in the Painted Desert region, you're thinking, does this place even have perennial streams? But we do in the Chuska Mountain region. We also have intermittent and ephemeral streams, as well as lakes, natural and both reservoirs. And then we have springs. We even have hanging gardens, which is pretty amazing when you think about the environment there, as well as groundwater. I think people often forget one of the key players in precipitation, evapotranspiration, and being able to have an understanding of those contributions
Adelante.
help with precipitation. Today, I'll be talking about the bimodal precipitation regime in the Four Corners region, as well as just giving you some history. So, associated with that, you may have wondered, how did the Navajo Nation grow to the size that it is today, spanning across Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico? And it was done so with different treaties. First, the Treaty of 1849, the 1868 Treaty, but also through different executive orders. So it was through the advocacy of Navajo leaders a long time ago that contributed to the growth of our tribal nation. Today, this is what it looks like. So we do have different lands. We do have land in Colorado. It's a ranch that we own there. But one of the interesting things to note of the Navajo Nation is it also surrounds another tribal nation, the Hopi tribe. So that creates some interesting relationships associated with being able to have an understanding about subwatersheds in the region, especially when headwaters start on Navajo Nation. Midsection goes through the Hopi tribe, and then the lower sections go back onto Navajo Nation. Just as far as monitoring, having an understanding of characterization. So just wanted to note that point. And the Navajo Nation is unique. Is it straddles the upper and the lower Colorado River Basin. Today, what I really want to be able to provide to you is an opportunity to have an understanding of why the information that you're helping relay to end users is useful for policy, decision making, as well as management. Especially in these critical times in the Colorado River Basin. You probably often hear of Colorado River Basin. You definitely always hear of Lake Powell and Lake Mead. and those levels of fluctuation. But what you may not have an understanding about is that there's 30 tribes in the Colorado River Basin. 29 of those tribes have there are federally recognized that have a reservation with it. One of those tribes, the San Juan Southern Paiute, is working to gain a reservation. And so I also wanted to describe that it's a largely populated area for the Navajo Nation. And we not only have land in the Colorado River Basin, but also the eastern part of the Navajo Nation is in the Rio Grande Basin. When you have an understanding about policy, it's important to understand those dynamics at the basin levels, if whether it be the Colorado River Basin or the Rio Grande Basin. One interesting thing to note is that historically, Navajo Nation has relied upon groundwater primarily. However, through water rights, that portfolio has been diversifying to include surface water. And so just wanted to note that as well. So with that being said, this is the area that is showing the outer boundary of the Navajo Nation. We do have three satellite communities. One Twahajile, which is west of Albuquerque, as well as west of Socorro. We have the Alamo Band of Navajo, and then south of Gallup, New Mexico, we have the Rama Navajo Band. But I wanted to show this watershed boundary map because, within these larger basin boundary areas of the Colorado River, you have like the San Juan River Basin, the Little Colorado River Basin, and then you have subwatersheds. And as I alluded to earlier, being able to have an understanding of the example I was particularly talking about was the Moenkopi, being able to show the area of start like Moenkopi, Denebito, Oribe, Palaka, and Jedito washes that do start on Navajo Nation, go through midsection of Hopi tribe, and then on to Navajo. Because I think it's important to have these understandings about the boundaries, either the state boundaries or the basin boundaries for watershed, or even tribal boundaries, because I think these may be things that may not be considered when setting up monitoring areas, and how different political boundaries may impact the ability to do monitoring in these regions. I know sometimes when we look at the Four Corners region, it looks kind of like a black hole, like not a lot's being done there. But I hope after today you have a better understanding of what's being done there, to be able to have a better understanding about water, as that having an understanding about water does relate to soil moisture. So the first thing, before proceeding, is to describe who I am. Crystal Tulley Cordova, Yenashia Twitch eating the Schlent Katnezatni Bashes Chin Hashkan had Zoha Edasha Chetwo, Hiklini Edashanale, Bestok Legendeshki, Do Twalagai Det Nasha, Navajo Nation Department of Water Resources, Banashnish, Principal Hydrologist Nishle. So I said I am of the Bitterwater clan, born for the Tangle People clan. My maternal grandmother's clan is the yucca fruit strung on a line, and my paternal grandfather's clan is the water that flows together. So as Indigenous people in this region, we have a strong connection to water, as well as to all things that relate to water. And so there's just this strong tie as Indigenous people to the land that we come from. And associated with that is having an understanding of the region that we live. And you may have been a tourist and on a road trip traveling through the Navajo Nation before. If you've not been there before, I highly recommend it. It's a beautiful area. I mean, John Wayne thought so, as well as Transformers. That's where they did filming at Monument Valley. But we also have Grand Falls and have other areas that do have the lake, that Sweetfills Lake. But why do I show you these pictures? I show you these pictures because as we think about, okay, before we had Thermoscientific, before we had Campbell, like what type of tools did we have? What did we use? And so I wanted to be able to remind you of those types of tools because you all have them for the most part. I mean, we use our senses. Kids a lot of times are more in tune with their senses, like how does something taste, smell, touch when you hear it, or different things. But, you know, for us as Indigenous people, those were the tools that we have. And so sometimes people wonder, like, how do these Indigenous people for millennia be able to stay in these regions for a long time as they have? So that's why I wanted to really show you these changes. I wanted to show you different areas of the Navajo Nation because when you see, you know, a lake that is there to be able to hold water, and then you see something in that's different than that, like Monument Valley. If you've ever been there, it's really hot. You should wear sunscreen and drink a lot of water because there's not a lot of water out there, and you just get really dried out. But associated with these different types of climates is being able to have an understanding that there's different types of soil moisture in these regions as well. And that temporally within a year, that may change depending on the season and the precipitation that may come to the region as well. So this is really thinking about site as well and these are really cool opportunities that I had to fly over our Navajo Nation. I mean, I just think it's beautiful by walking on the ground, but when you see it from a plane, it really provides a different experience. And the pilots that I went with were from Planet Women, and they were so surprised. Like I didn't need a map to tell them where we were. They were it was just something so fascinating to them. And we flew like a large area and they were just so fascinated. Like, how do you even know? Like, have you ever seen your land from the sky before? And I had informed them that I hadn't, but just having an understanding about growing up in the region was really that bringing back that familiarity. So another thing is thinking about another type. Um, and I don't think I can play this, but this is a video of my daughter listening to music that is being played here in this community event, but she's just watching them and then she's following what they're doing. So it's one of those things, right? Like sometimes we use our sound as well. I don't know how many of you have been in the field before, but maybe you were in a dry region and you were walking and you were saying, well, actually on the map there's a spring somewhere around here. So then you have to use your senses of being able to hear like where things might be changing, or even in a defense mode, being in the mountains, being aware of like, is there a bear over there, or is there some kind of activity in this region, just to for your own situational awareness. And so just bringing that to you as well. So I didn't tell her to do that. It's just one of those things, right? And as Indigenous people, that's what we do. We see what we're doing and then we learn it throughout these generations. The other thing we have is touch. So in the field work that you're in, when you're in the field, I think touch is really key to what you're working with to be able to have a better understanding about the soil. And we love to grow food. I mean, it's very difficult to grow food where we live, but we've been doing it for generations. I learned to be able to grow food from my grandfather, and now my dad is teaching his grandkids about growing food, and we start them from seeds. We don't sometimes we use these from other people that donate them to us, like Home Depot starters. If we have a really challenging time, like growing tomatoes are really hard, so we'll use a starter from there, but from the most part, we try to grow these from seeds, especially the corn, beans, and squash. But then it's really important to be able to have this understanding of the using your tools that you have, your hands, to be able to have an understanding about the environment. Also important sometimes. So I'm a geologist by training. I went to University of New Mexico, got an Earth and Planetary Sciences degree, and then I got a master's in hydroscience from the University of New Mexico, and then I went to the University of Utah, and got my PhD there. But as a geologist, sometimes you do tasting, like to find like how the grittiness of it. And so this is sometimes one of my favorite tools is being able to use our taste buds to be able to find different ways of how the environment may be different, or in these cases of the types of food that we can grow and be able to benefit from. And being able to butcher is also a unique skill, so that we can be able to pass that down from generations. But the other thing is being able to use our senses. Sometimes I think even in the field, right? Depending on the type of place that you might be at, there may be really strong scents. I saw that there's crystal hot springs down the way. Or if you've ever been to Yellowstone, you definitely smell the differences at where you may be, or near Pagosa Springs is another example. But some of those scents are really important to our environment as well. And so being able to smell fire. One of my favorite scents is being in the desert and after it rains, just that lingering scent of not only the ground, but also the sage in the area. So, moving on from this, the Navajo Nation Department of Water Resources has become more sophisticated in having an understanding about our region. And so, our hydrometeorological network is spanning across the nation. There's intermittent variability in the time frame that has been evaluated. We do have precip sites. Some of them started as nearly as early as the 1950s and 60s, but we've been steady with the amount that we've had to remain around 89. We have several snow course survey sites. We have two snow tell sites. We also have stream gauging sites. But all of this information is really key to having an understanding of those regions. So during my research, I partnered with the department that I now work for in trying to have a better understanding about what the precipitation like is in the region, because I mean when you googled Navajo precip, like nothing came up. Now you Google it, the paper that I publish now comes up, for which these graphs do come from. So one thing to note is that, growing up in the area, I knew that we had rain in the summer, we had snow in the winter, but we didn't have anything that showed that, at least on a published version, and be able to describe how that variability occurred through the Navajo Nation. And so using that data of those precipitation sites and focusing on water years from 2002 to 2015, that's what this information is based on. So it's a bimodal precipitation regime. You see that the majority of the Navajo Nation gets their precipitation during the summer, whereas the mountainous region, which is in green, gets their precipitation from winter, their peak precipitation. You see one interesting thing. June is the driest time of year for this region. This past June was really wet. So that was an anomaly, just being able to describe that, having a wet June. Also, the interesting thing to note is just the peak periods for North American monsoon is different, for the majority of the Navajo Nation. But what's also interesting is just breaking up that bimodal precipitation regime. So the x-axis are the years of water years, and then the y-axis on top is the winter precip. On the bottom graph is the summer precipitation. And so what you can see is for winter precipitation, they really follow the same trend across the region. And I mean, that's the type of storms that contribute to winter precip. Whereas um, I used to herd sheep growing up, and it could be like where I was taking this bottom picture, completely dry where I was standing, but I could see off in the distance that there was rain in the area. And so across the region of the Navajo Nation, you can see that those North American monsoon are not as, I guess, well behaved across the region as winter precipitation. But looking at a year-to-year comparison, the top graph is total annual precipitation for those years observed. The bottom graph is summer to total annual. So a 1 would mean that 100% of that precipitation was due to summer. A 0 would indicate 100% of that precipitation was due to winter. So when we take a year like 2005, which is a peak year for total annual precipitation, you can see that for 2005, the majority of that precipitation for that year was due to winter, whereas the following year in 2006, it was due to summer precipitation, contributing to that total annual precipitation. So what does that really mean? I mean, for people in the region, sometimes people would say, we have a wet summer, that means we're going to have a wet winter. But what this research really showed was that they're independent of one another. So there's differences in the precipitation throughout the region. In case you're interested, I also did stable isotope research in the Navajo Nation. This is just a summary of that stable isotopic research. So I had gathered over 4 years, 2,000 plus samples of groundwater, springs, streams, lakes, and precip throughout the Navajo Nation. And so just a prominent seasonal maximum in Navajo Nation precipitation water occurs during the peak of the North American monsoon, and peak monsoon precipitation water isotopes are similar across broad geographic regions, reflecting intensive land surface recycling. And then monsoon water contributes minimally to runoff and groundwater recharge, basically describing that any impact to monsoonal precipitation doesn't really impact the recharge to those groundwater streams, lakes. Whereas winter precipitation, any changes to that could be detrimental for depending on the precipitation amounts to those groundwater, springs, streams, lakes. These are the stream gauging sites that we do have in case you're interested. And then we also have snow course survey. If you're interested in any of this information, we do have Carl McClellan who keeps that information. Our systems are not sophisticated enough to be able to have everything online. So that's one of the challenges that we have, just being able to have a server and reliable internet to be able to keep things up and going, as well as, I guess, along that same front, I know many of you really rely on real-time data. Sometimes that's really a challenge, especially in the Navajo Nation. I mean, you're thinking about a place where 30% of the population doesn't have running water and doesn't have electricity. And even when you think about cell service, I have two cell phones. That's because, I have to be able to make communication. But even the cell networks to be able to provide information in these remote regions is not sufficient enough to be able to support these systems. And so you may think, well, of course, that's where satellite opportunities can come in. But when you think about the price tag of that, that can be a limiting factor for operation maintenance and replacement costs. And so right now, with these precip sites, no course surveys, as well as the stream monitoring sites, we have people going out in the field to be able to collect that information. But luckily for us, we have friends like you who help us monitor drought. One thing I really appreciate about the Drought Monitor is the fact that they have tribal boundaries included in their evaluation as potential layers when an end user has the opportunity to evaluate. And so for this year, for this time period, I chose before winter precip came, after winter precip, and then before the monsoon of precipitation started. But so what you can see is that winter was helpful to the region across the area just to help us with our drought conditions. But it's not enough to make us completely white, meaning not having the existence of drought. And so right now we have, over 50% of the nation in drought conditions, from abnormally to severe dry drought conditions. When we are able to use a time series, that helps us be able to make the case of being able to compare to past years, like how is our conditions faring with what we've experienced in the past. And so granted, when I worked for the Navajo Nation, I started back in 2018. So when you see that, that was during the two time periods where we had exceptional drought conditions, which were really challenging for the nation. And so when we have data like this information is really helpful for us to be able to declare a drought declaration and have the President of the United States be able to sign that. Because then for us, that provides the opportunity for federal funding to because drought is considered a natural disaster to be able to seek opportunities that can help us help our communities that are really impacted by this region, impacted by the drought that varies across the region. One thing I didn't put up here was DSET. So DSET, the drought severity evaluation tool, was collaboration between Desert Research Institute as well as NASA. That really provided us an opportunity to look at a community-based level. So unfortunately with Drought Monitor, it doesn't provide us as a Navajo Nation. It just shows the county boundaries. And so those county boundaries are useful for the state that can be able to distribute resources at a county level. But for Navajo Nation, we have 110 communities. And so when all of the squeaky wheels, 110 communities are sounding at once, it's difficult for us to use tools like this to be able to describe these are the areas that are hit the most. And so that's why we're allocating these resources to these regions. Whereas DSET can help with that, but one of the challenges with DSET was just the opportunity for continued operation to keep up with those budget costs associated for that tool. Online tools are great when you know how to use them. I heard the opportunity of maybe things that Jason talking about what things can be done in the future, being able to, get a room full of end users in the room and be able to tell them how's this tool working for you or working together to work out the kinks. Because I think, as a developer, so I've done that before, been on the development side. And when you think about like, oh, this is like, they could be able to drive the car themselves and then you give it to the person and they're like it's not as simple as you thought you made it. So definitely encourage that opportunity. But why does that matter? Like why do we want to learn about drought? Because there are people and animals, other living things that are vulnerable to drought, such as domestic water haulers, public drinking water systems, irrigators and dryland farmers, ranchers, recreation, wildlife, and forestry. And I know that, a lot of you have fun being able to create the tools and be able to get into the data, but maybe you don't. Sometimes it's kind of you're working on things so much that you're so focused that you don't realize the ripple effect that the work that you do can provide for communities. Because when you have a place like the Navajo Nation, where the majority, a third of the population doesn't have running water, the red indicates more than 200 homes that don't have running water. The orange is indicating 150 to 200 homes, and 100 to 150 for the yellow. I grew up hauling water, and you think about it, right? Like you think, well, probably my great grandparents didn't have running water, but you think someone like me who doesn't seem that old, like how do you not have the opportunity to haul water? I have, nieces and nephews now that don't have running water, and some that barely even got electricity. So that can be life-changing to have those basic necessities. But um building projects like this is important. This is a Navajo Gallup water supply project. It was a water rights fund-based settlement, and being able to have this is one of those opportunities to be able to diversify our water portfolio. So we settled water rights in the San Juan River Basin in New Mexico. It's a fund-based settlement, so that money was provided by the federal government under Public Law 111-11, and the beneficiaries include the Navajo Nation, the Hickory Apache Nation, and the City of Gallup. And the purpose of the water project is to divert 22,200 and or 650 acre feet per year of San Juan River water. If you don't know, San Juan River is a tributary to the Colorado River, and making full circle, having an understanding about the conditions is really key to having an understanding about the water availability, about the management of a system like the Colorado River Basin. And so this is the monthly temperature outlook. So we can see that it's above. I just came from Salt Lake from over the weekend, and I lived in Salt Lake for a long time during my PhD, and experiencing the temperatures that I did over the weekend was like really unique. Like I hadn't experienced that. It was pretty crazy to me to be able to experience those triple digits. um, in Salt Lake. And even going to the mountain to Park City, I'm like, it's got to be cooler there, but not significantly cooler. But looking at precipitation outlook is also important for us because the work that you do contributes to soil moisture and being able to evaluate soil moisture across the region. And when you think about soil moisture, this past week I had a call with reclamation, and we have a call every month to talk about the conditions um, for Navajo Dam because Navajo Nation has storage rights to Navajo Reservoir. Navajo Reservoir is a smaller reservoir in the upper Colorado River Basin that contributes to flows to Lake Powell. So, having an understanding about the soil moisture, I'm like, hey, can you give me a reading about how soil moisture is right now? And so when it's really saturated, then that's a different condition than when it's really dry. Because when it's really dry, it's like a parking lot, then more water can make it down to support the reservoirs. But I mean, what we really want to see is healthy soil moisture that can help our conditions across the region. The one thing I wanted to put, Dave's here, and we're thankful for his partnership because, we're trying to get out of that black hole scenario that I was talking about where people don't think things are going on in the region that we occupy as a Navajo Nation, but through partnerships and opportunities through the bipartisan infrastructure law, there's funding to be able to provide the opportunity to increase monitoring sites across not only the state, but also including the Navajo Nation. So we're thankful for that partnership because when you have a place that has an outer boundary that looks like this, that is in not only the Colorado River Basin, but also the Rio Grande Basin, having an understanding about those conditions really impact the opportunities the well those challenges highlight the opportunities that can come through there's different stakeholders in the Colorado River Basin as well as the Rio Grande Basin. And so being able to inform policymakers as well as inform the managers of the basins and how they occupy a system is really important, especially for those people who live within those individual basins. And so grateful for the work that you do and the opportunities for partnership that can continue into the future. And so in case you're ever wondering, is anyone ever seeing the work that I'm doing, particularly contributing to work like NIDIS? Definitely we are. Tribes are wanting to have a better understanding about those end user tools, and we look forward to greater partnership. Ahiha. Thank you.
Thank you, Crystal. I'm going to invite you to stay up here. We have about 10 minutes now for the opportunity for any discussion or questions that you guys like to have, and as well as from our friends online. See you back there, Nathan. Hold on one second for our friends online. I was going to make an attempt to repeat that, but I'm going to just give you a shot to say it to our friends online.
So in the Great Plains, there's a tension between overwhelmingly the response is positive to quantify parts of hydrology, but there is somewhat of a concern that water that is not utilized in the modern maybe industrial sense of the word, that quantifying that can endanger water rights.
Thank you for that question. So there's different types of monitoring, right? Specifically speaking, like about climate station opportunities, I did present, I guess a couple of summers ago to some of the Great Plains tribes, particularly those tribes that work for Rosebud as well as for Pine Ridge. And, for them, I think they had a desire to learn more about drought from the perspective of what type of tools do you use to be able to declare drought, those sorts of things. From what I understand from your question, it's different than being able to use data to develop a situation, having an understanding about where drought conditions are in a particular region, but it's more about quantification of water and that understanding. So for the Colorado River Basin specifically, there's a need to be able to have that understanding because of the availability. So I mean, the challenge with the Colorado River is the imbalance between the wet water and the paper water. So paper water describes it one way of how much a water should be available, but as we've experienced, unprecedented drought conditions have really challenged that water availability. Mother Nature's not providing that water amount. And so speaking to the desires of tribes in that region, this past week, there was congressional introduction of the Northeastern Arizona Indian Water Rights Settlement Act of 2024 into Congress by Senators Mark Kelly and Sinema, and then on the House side by Ciscomani and others. Why do I mention that? I mention that because of this situation of the wet water supply. Because of the way water rights occur in the West, it's really first in time, first in right. And if you're not included in having a piece of that pie, then you really are limited in where your water supply comes from. And so as you saw from that map that showed the homes without pipe water, the majority of our nation is in Arizona, but we don't have we don't have resolved water rights in Arizona. And we were doing two routes, litigation, anything. If you know anything about litigation, meaning fighting things out in court, it takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of money and it doesn't go anywhere. And we've been in litigation since the 1980s to versus settlement, where there's an opportunity for people to be at the table, negotiate opportunities. And so for us as a tribe, one of the opportunities that we've seen is through working our quantification amounts out through settlement. But you bring up a point like undeveloped, unused tribal water. And in this time period where in the Colorado River Basin, people are being compensated for conservation. There's water that's being used that's tribal water, but it's considered system water. And a junior user is being paid money to conserve that water and being compensated for it, where that's from an equity standpoint, that just provides challenges. But it's one of those things, the way water law occurs in the United States, to where you have to be able to show beneficial use before you're provided the opportunity to conserve water in order to get compensated. And so for us, it's really a differing type. As far as where we're situationally located as a tribe, whereas, quantifying our water right provides that opportunity for a better seat at the table. So that, of that, so if you know anything about the Colorado River Basin, there is an upper portion for Arizona that is 50,000 acre feet. And the majority of land of where that's at is the Navajo Nation. And so under this settlement that I described that was introduced into Congress, 44,700 of that would be Navajo Nation. And so that's like almost 90% of that water provides that seat at the table to describe how, the management of the system should occur to where we're not negatively impacted. So hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you, Crystal. Thank you, Nathan. We have a few more minutes here for any further questions. If there's any questions online. Yes. I'm gonna bring the mic to you.
I saw that you brought up the seasonal forecast map from the Climate Prediction Center. I was just curious how the Navajo Nation uses those seasonal forecasts in their planning and decision-making processes.
So this further goes to the seat at the table. So having an understanding about those temperature and precipitation into the future really provides an opportunity for us to have a better understanding about the water supply availability. So I mentioned that Navajo has storage rights to a reservoir in the upper Colorado River Basin, but we also have in-stream flow rights as well. And so when you have an understanding about what the temperature is going to be, what the precipitation is going to be, it really provides an opportunity to know how is that going to impact flow? I mean, obviously a lot of things go into prediction. I probably shouldn't have to tell you that. And one thing that you'll probably tell me and counter is, well, there's a great range of variability that we could be right. So with that being said, we do take any opportunity that we have, because when we think about our area, it's not just the over 27,000 square miles that we worry about. Things that are going outside of our boundary area impact us. And so having an understanding about different spatial scales provides us an opportunity to have a better understanding of internally how are we going to prepare. So one thing that we do have out there is we have a drought declaration. And so the question that will be coming likely in a few weeks is, do we continue a reaffirmation of that drought declaration? And so using those tools that not only provide the monthly outlook, but even further than that, provides us the opportunity to be able to use database evidence to provide to our Navajo leadership that, yes, you should reaffirm the drought conditions because of what we're currently experiencing. According to the U.S. Drought Monitor, we're still experiencing over 50% of our nation being in some type of drought condition.
Thank you. Yes, Mike.
How is climate change affecting your water resources?
Great question. So we do have a paper out there in case what I provide you is going to be very high level, but in case you're interested, there's a report out there that has been done. If you Google Navajo Nation climate variability adaptation, it was by UC Boulder. And so you can see in that water resources chapter of how we're really impacted. But speaking generally, we've definitely seen earlier snowmelt runoff, decrease in snowpack. We've also had increase in frequency and magnitude of drought and flooding conditions. And one of those things might be interesting, right? Because if you're from Louisiana, you're kind of like, oh, well, we're familiar with flooding, but maybe in the southwestern United States, you're like flooding and drought coexisting with each other. We do experience that not only from snowmelt runoff, but also from monsoonal precipitation that really isolates some of the communities. I was just in the field last week, and flooding impacted those communities where they were displaced from their families. About 20 families were displaced from their homes for 3 months because of flooding. And it's like in an area that is like the driest part of the Navajo Nation. And so just to be able to describe that, more information could be found on those other things. But as far as just speaking from a precipitation standpoint, it has definitely decreased our flows in our ephemeral, perennial, and intermittent streams as well.
What about the increase in temperature?
So I describe things from a precipitation standpoint. Definitely in the Navajo Nation, we don't have the data to be able to show about the increase in temperature and what those impacts are. But I know a lot of our people don't have coolers. I mean, obviously, I just described a third of our population doesn't have electricity. So when we're experiencing those types of conditions, people go outside. But I mean, as far as comparing to that to like public health emergencies and the impacts that we're seeing as far as temperatures, we're definitely like, I grew up in the Navajo Nation, so it's one of those things like I can say like it's definitely hotter than I remember it being, but being able to show that with the data temporally on a scale, we just don't have that temperature data throughout the Navajo Nation.
Great questions. Thank you, Crystal. Any final burning thoughts or questions from folks in the audience or online? Nope. Awesome. Well, we look forward to continuing the discussion on our first break if you would like. Just out the door, there are refreshments for everybody. We'll reconvene back at 10:30, and that'll put us back on track. So appreciate y'all.